there's any one fact of life, it's that we all live our last day eventually. Depending on the person, the most beautiful and the most tragic thing of life is the finite nature of it. For most of us, we have no idea when we will really die, and that's a universal fear that people of all cultures may dread. During realizations like this, it may be important to think about what life means to you. Despite how stressful times may get, we all share experiences that make us human. We experience joy, sadness, terror, and love. Oftentimes, we do this through the connections we make. Being communicational creatures by our nature, sometimes these connections can become so special they quite literally feel larger than life. But what if you knew you were going to die soon? What would you do? Would you attempt to experience things in life that you never got to before you can't anymore? Would you do nothing at all and simply accept what is coming? Would you try to make sense of why this could possibly be happening to you? Or would you want to leave something behind for those that you love, or for anyone that may stumble upon it? Well, deep in the far reaches of this massive land we call the internet, somebody did just that. While it hasn't been stumbled on by very many people, those that have found it are in awe of what lies inside. It is considered one of the most disturbing websites on the entire internet. It is also considered one of the most mysterious websites on the entire internet, with the contents inside being a total enigma to anyone that has attempted to figure it all out. Tonight, we will take a vast journey into the early history of the internet. We will attempt to finally uncover the truth behind this website. That off the surface seems terrifying and nonsensical all at the same time. But trust me, we will make it make sense. Tonight we will tell the tale behind the website, deathandhell.com. The way in which I accidentally stumbled upon this website was the same way I accidentally find most of our internet mysteries, while searching for anything. I discovered this Reddit post, searching for some volunteers to go and find the meaning of deathandhell.com. On this post, the website was described as having an extreme amount of occult and religious symbolism, as well as being organized into a multitude of sections, most of which being really disturbing, but not making any sense. Some people were even doubting the legitimacy of anything that was being said, as this reply illustrates. His ramblings are nonsense, and his form of Satanism or demonolatry does not exist in the annals of history, and he has very basic knowledge on magic, so all I can guess is that this is a creepypasta/ARG of some kind. The overall impression to these Redditors was that this page was extremely disturbing, but the occult practices mentioned did not exist in the real world. Regardless of if I thought this was real or not, this was all enough for me to visit the website, and it certainly was not what I would have expected. Before you can see the rest of the website, you are greeted with a lengthy message all about what this website is supposed to be. In the 18 months before my death, I proceeded to set forth the keys to death and hell. This process, I envisioned a snapshot of the world as it appeared to me at that time. Literally a cut and paste sculpture taken from various articles, science fiction, cultural and political events, happenings in the realm of a culture. Flame wars on the Z list, my life, my world, my email, etc. So it was just a cut-up of these things. Somehow from this cut-up leaked out the most beautiful vision of infinite compassion, and this vision came forth and stood forth even amongst all the horror. It shone through so bright, really true, and undeniably real. There was more compassion and love for me than I'd ever dreamed or imagined. It was like a garden paradise all around me, blooming with beauty and love. It was there all the time, this unbelievable garden, and it opened up to me. My life has been like heaven in so many ways. I am grateful I had an opportunity to see this possibility, and I want to share it with my fellow sentient beings. Even though death and hell may look like it is all dark and black and all horror, right there, glimmering on the other side, is infinite compassion. Right there. The clear light is shimmering through the void. It's not that hard to see if you just open up your eyes and look around. My wife, Andrea Agadi, and the love we were reflecting back and forth between each other is so magnificent and powerful that it was like we were facing death every day, celebrating our love every day. We were facing it because that was the way we lived, but for me, maybe it took the imminence of physical death to bring it into full clarity. As my own death approaches steadily, I am blessed and deeply moved by the enormous display of affection and love for my daughter Heidi. Heidi's love is a limitless ocean that has healed me so much from the pain of life. Though she is young, 17, and losing her dad, she shows all the signs of blooming into a spectacular woman of insight and compassion. I am surprised and grateful for the outpouring of tenderness. Seeing those around me, and especially my only child, offering me such unconditional love and compassion changes me, heals me, and reaffirms the silent knowledge of my heart. When my sister Laurie died, she gave me a greater understanding of death, and the communiques or transmissions that I've received from her, and my grandmother too, reveal much about the after-death state. Though my heart touches many who are in this life still, it reaches also across the boundaries to touch those who have gone before me. Their bravery fuels my own. It is in their path of stars and ghostly footsteps that I will walk in. These are the gifts I take with me. I will go caressed by kisses of Nut. I face death without fear. I leave for this world, the keys of death and hell, to unlock the secrets we keep from ourselves. But for any who would wonder or wander, lost in Temple Dahmer, I want to declare that the real secret of deathandhell.com is infinite compassion. Those who know will know. The archetypal theriomorph is in the lotus, in eternal love and chaos. Infek bin Laden, 11/11/01. Now, I know what you may be thinking. Where is the mystery? This heartfelt explanation seems to have already answered everything, right? Well, in truth, this is only the beginning. Upon entering the actual site, you are greeted with a pentagram and a cube of icons all around it. As you can see, all the cubes with images are clickable, and are what the contents of the website are. Beyond that, each section on this site is huge, containing an absolute slew of info. Upon clicking the icon on the top left labeled Liber Nephistorum, you are greeted with this. A primitive animation featuring eyes, teeth, and other things. But if you notice, some of these objects are clickable. Most of these clickable images lead to really disturbing results that I already can't present, featuring crude 3D art of nudity and, well, death. Although you can start seeing the maze that is this website, because even inside these images, there are more images that can be clicked, the most notable of which actually does lead to a lengthy piece of text. This is where we begin to see that unexplainable yet disturbing nature of what is being said here. A lot of this article seems to be about sex magicians and other, much more disturbing sexual actions, most commonly being some extremely vivid descriptions involving necrophilia. There are pages more of this article too, and many times when one of these disturbing sexual activities are mentioned, they're said to be done inside the Temple Dahmer, which is also something that appeared on the initial message before entering the site. As you can see by going back to what looks like this section's table of contents, there are a lot of articles, all full of this disturbing type of information that all seem for the most part completely unable to be understood. And if you go to the next section actually titled Temple Dahmer, you will see much more of this same thing. The first section here talks about how murder is considered the most heinous crime in our society, but we all experience it every single day through media coverage. It then talks about black magic, and how it is amazing since you can manipulate people to do these heinous actions for you. This is probably the most straightforward passage on the website so far, but upon entering the next section, it feels like we're back to where we started in terms of understanding. Lots of other article sections here almost seem like edited advertisements or news clippings made to be as horrifying as possible. Now, since most of the other sections will also leave you feeling the exact same way, it would be a waste of time to go through each of them, tell you that they are disturbing and hard to understand, and then move on to the next to say the same thing. As a result, I did look through each and every one of these sections, and here are a few of the passages that definitely stood out. Inside the Necromemicon section, you're greeted with this passage that I found very interesting. Without discussion, on 12/28/2000, NWLink.com Hosting Co. pulled the plug on the world's largest satanic website, deathandhell.com, citing obscenity as the grounds for removal. Coincidentally, the site had previously been visited by none other than the US Department of Defense in an investigation of Infek bin Laden. It's of course impossible for me to prove that these things were really true, but I found it very interesting to spotlight. Overall though, the section that seems to hold the most direct information is the one titled Infek bin Laden, As you might have expected, it does give us some information behind the man of this site. The first section here is entitled Early Magical Experiences. Around the age of 5, I was vacationing with my relatives south of Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. Late one afternoon, I lost my plastic bucket and shovel, alien artifacts, in the surf, and watched from the beach as they were swept out into the Atlantic. My mother called me home for supper, and I remember whining to my mom about the loss of my bucket and shovel. My grandmother said, "Don't worry, honey, I'll have it for you tomorrow morning." I wondered what she had in mind. I heard she was the 7th child of a 7th child, and I'd heard rumors of my grandmother's magical powers from my earliest memories. Later that evening, I must have forgotten about the bucket and shovel incident. I rose at dawn the next morning, excited to be the first one of my family awake, and the first tracks on the beach. I ran down to the water's edge, and I will never forget the intense beauty of the sun rising from the bottom of the sea. My tracks weren't the only tracks on the beach. One set of footprints headed north, and I could see someone walking from quite a distance, far enough down the beach as to be only an almost indistinguishable figure. As I stood watching the sunrise, the lone figure approached. As soon as I recognized it was my grandmother, I ran to greet her. She was carrying the bucket and shovel. I knew they'd be here this morning, just like I promised you. From that moment on, I never doubted the power of magic. Infect Bin Laden. After this, we have a section called Carry the Lantern High. This is a much lengthier section that goes into more detail on Infect's personal life. He begins it by citing the day, September 21st, 1977, where he met a woman and spent most of the afternoon at her house. He mentioned how there were multiple young women living there, and they had invited him to observe a tarot reading. He talks about how he'd been feeling uneasy all day and declined. He discusses how at some point one of the women came downstairs looking distraught. When he asked what was wrong, he stated that a young girl would die in the house that night. This was something that he tried to shut down, as he assured her that tarot cards would not make something like that come true. Later on in the night, he mentioned having a sexual encounter with one of the women there, but during this, she suddenly became very distant, stating that something is going to happen tonight that will change your life forever. Infect was very uncomfortable and mentioned that he was going to leave. She said that it didn't matter if you leave or not, your life is never going to be the same after tonight. And supposedly, right when she said this, the door to the room creaked open by itself. Infect was very disturbed and left after this. He did mention that he was high and he had put this stash in his car. He remembered that his sister was supposed to be visiting him that night, and midway through his drive home, he was pulled over. At this moment, he assumed that this was what those premonitions were leading up to. He would be pulled over with a bunch of illegal substances, and this would surely change his life forever. However, when the officer arrived, he just told him to slow down and left. He was spared. As he continued driving back, he saw an ambulance pass by that for some reason particularly disturbed him. He found this weird due to the fact that since childhood he had become pretty desensitized to ambulances, always assuming they held people he didn't know. The next morning, he had found out that his sister had been the one that died, supposedly at approximately the moment the door opened by itself. Within 2 weeks of her death, he wanted answers, and so he returned to that house, only to find a vacant lot and a pile of ashes. Like a bizarre southern ghost story, the house had mysteriously burned to the ground and the strange woman had vanished. I saw one of them a year or so later from a distance in a crowd, but I never saw either of them again after that. He then mentioned 2 separate incidents of friends very close to his sister that mentioned what seemed like her contacting them from beyond. The reason that this was so notable was because of a pact they made to each other when he was around 12 years old. Whichever of us were the first to die, we would do whatever we could to leave a sign for the other one. It seems like those signs were left. Infect even supposedly had a series of dreams and visions hoping that all these experiences were just neurons misfiring. Otherwise, he'd have to pay for all his crimes against nature. If you are the first to go, leave a sign to let us know. Infect Bin Laden. Carry the lantern high. There's also a section titled Draft Dodger. This was supposedly written by a psychotherapist to a Vietnam War drafter who had some comments to say the least about Infect. He mentioned seeing him when he was a junior in high school, where he was supposedly frequently absent. He was also a heavy drug user at this time, using a lot of hallucinogens and advocating pretty heavily for the drug experience. This letter also goes into him as a person in the years after high school, where it is said that he reports visual and kinesthetic hallucinations to some degree all the time, even when he has been off acid for a month. It mentions how he was put into psychotherapy for a year, but had no change in attitude regarding the drug scene whatsoever. For these reasons, this person thinks that Infect could not accept a situation that requires discipline, and so he does not recommend that he be qualified for military service. Outside of these entries, the rest of this section is filled with photos, whether that be his own art, him, or even his partner. This section certainly helped quite a lot in giving some background behind the person that is Infect, and while it definitely might have explained why he got interested in all the things he did, it doesn't explain much else. At this point, I had a few main questions. Assuming that Infect bin Laden was not this person's real name, was that name truly inspired by who I think it could have been? Since the man had been dead for 2 decades, who was running the site now? It is still open, so there is to be somebody upholding the domain. And lastly, is there any way or anybody out there that could help me figure out what essentially 90% of this website is actually talking about? It also doesn't help that I'm not exactly the most knowledgeable on occult practices or Satanism in general. Regardless, these types of questions pretty much leave me exactly where it seems everybody else that had visited these sites were. But I didn't want to give up. Was it possible for me to find the answers that I so desired? The first thing I wanted to do was simply search up Death and Hell on Google, just to see if there was any other places online where it was talked about. Perhaps unsurprisingly, this really didn't help out too much, as pretty much every single entry was religious in nature, so I decided to search up Infect bin Laden to see if I could find anything different. In doing this, I did. Most of the results still weren't really useful, but I did find a multitude of Reddit threads about him. Really though, most of these seemed to be questions about him and about some other man named Mark DeFreitas. Lots of these threads didn't even feature any replies either. However, there was one final thread that would finally give me a lead, and it was a massive one. This thread was a linked over blog post about a practice called Psychedelic Chaos Satanism, posted onto the Satanism subreddit. To the few that saw this, it seemed to resonate with them quite nicely. Somebody even said that they totally were a Chaos Satanist, and asked the OP if they could use this term. In response, the OP says, "I didn't invent it. My late husband did. Infect bin Laden." His online sarcophagus is Death and Hell. If you were to dig through his cryptic and disturbing prophecies there, you would find references to Chaos Satanism, Latter-day Satanism, and Psychedelic Chaos Satanism. He is the originator as far as I can remember. That's right, the owner of this account was the then partner of Infect bin Laden himself. Upon this discovery, I reached out to her. I had no idea if I'd get a response or not, but I sure hoped I would. As I sat around waiting with bated breath, I wound up getting a notification on my phone. As it turns out, I did get a response. "Hello, I can talk with you about..." As she responded to me, she accepted my request, and truthfully gave me more information than I ever thought was possible. As I said, I was not previously knowledgeable at all with the occult, and so as a result this website was definitely even more difficult to understand than it already may have been. Through these exchanges, I was able to receive a lot of context, both about the scene in Infect's area, as well as much more about his story as a whole. Without further ado, I suppose I will just get into all of this now. It's time to tell the true story of Infect, his views on everything, and to supply the proper context to this all. As far back as 150 years ago, the seeds for what now would be considered occultism in a modern form was being planted. In particular, in the early 1900s, a man named Aleister Crowley started a group called the Ordo Templi Orientis, which itself was a spin-off of another group called the Golden Dawn, who are a secret society dedicated to magic and mysticism. The Ordo Templi Orientis was also full of British people into the concepts of magic, and together they created a system of thought that mixed Eastern religion, Egyptian philosophy, and other things together. Speaking of magic, Crowley is also responsible for coining the use of the term magic, spelled with a K, which is primarily how it is spelled in occult usage. Around the same time though, there was another man who was also planting some very important seeds, particularly in Infect's case. Austin Osman Spare is considered the grandfather of chaos magic, which is a term that is all over deathandhell.com. Spare invented sigil magic, which involves creating a sigil as a way of communicating with your own unconscious mind. The concept doesn't necessarily have to be inherently supernatural either, as it may sound to be. In fact, there seems to be conflicting views surrounding sigil magic as a whole. Some people truly believe that they can affect the fate of the universe with this form of magic, but other people see it as more of a psychological thing. By shaping your own behavior and attitudes, you'll come to interact differently with the world and thereby see the effect of your magic. Infect's partner, who we will be referring to as AJ, falls into the second camp, but nonetheless considers it to be a powerful practice. In the 1960s and 70s, chaos magic in a modern form was solidified by a man named Peter Carroll, who wrote a number of books about the subject. His chaos magic is seen as being a take on Austin Osman Spare's views, but which included quantum physics and math. A group of study revolving around Carroll's work would eventually be born too, known as the Illuminates of Thanateros, which is a combination of the Greek words for death and sex. This group still has activity in Germany, and Infect supposedly attended many international gatherings and was considered a very high-ranking member. Another very old magical concept that was very important through all this was that of gematria. The gematria is a form of cipher that assigns numbers to all the letters in the Hebrew alphabet. The roots of this idea began possibly as far back as the 8th century. Essentially, old Jewish mages were trying to find a connection between language and math. They thought that if they could find it, then it would unlock secrets to our world and somehow prove the existence of a higher power. Going back to the aforementioned Aleister Crowley, in 1901 he wrote The Book of the Law. This book was supposedly written while he was on a honeymoon, and he asked his wife to transcribe what he was channeling. This took place over 3 consecutive days, where according to him, between the hours of noon and 1 p.m. for all 3 of them, he was visited by the voice of a god named Iwis, which he heard over his left shoulder. He said that he was also able to get an impression of the being's appearance, describing it as having a body composed of fine matter and having gauze-like transparency. The 3 chapters of the book were supposedly spoken by 3 separate deities. Regardless of if you even think something like that is possible, or was the result of some sort of insane drug trip, or both, the book went on to become incredibly influential, and the subject of debate and endless investigation all the way until now. Even among Crowley himself, he's recognized the possibility that this voice of Aiwass was just a product of his own subconscious repressed self, though he doesn't see it as likely. Regardless, this book is a riddle, with the challenge being to try and find a new gematria, one based on English, not Hebrew, with the book promising that whoever shall crack the code can then understand all the riddles of the book. Generations of people have attempted to crack the code to no avail. But just when AJ was first meeting Infect, he had supposedly just been receiving international recognition for creating a gematria that cracked this code. And going back to the site, one of the sections is entirely dedicated to this whole process. Infect would be congratulated by specialists who had dedicated their entire lives to cracking this code. One of them, named Ian Orange, knew Infect beforehand from an internet group in the late 90s known as the Z-List, which is also mentioned on the site a multitude of times. This group was run by a man named Mariq Defrades, which is the reason why I kept finding his name whenever I searched up Infect bin Laden. Followers of Infect became known as Zensiders, and they gained significant notoriety after this event. As for Satanism itself, despite being a term that has been used through a huge portion of recorded history, predominantly by Christians, there did not seem to be much organized practice, specifically entitled Satanism, until around the 1950s. The man who undoubtedly popularized this practice in a modern sense was Anton LaVey, who was quite the controversial person. He created the Church of Satan, which became known as the first organized church devoted to Satan. It's important to note that this religion does not literally believe in Satan's existence. Instead, he basically serves as a symbol and archetype who represents pride, carnality, and enlightenment. While this religion was a first in recorded history, it has since become very controversial to Satanists after it. The Church of Satan promotes this belief that everything is immoral, and it also enforces a very individualistic mindset, which goes against many forms of Satanism that would arise after it. The largest form of modern Satanism today is the Satanic Temple. This form of Satanism is much less individualistic, as they themselves put best. The mission of the Satanic Temple is to encourage benevolence and empathy, reject tyrannical authority, advocate practical common sense, oppose injustice, and undertake noble pursuits. They have 7 fundamental tenets that they abide by. 1. One should strive to act with compassion and empathy toward all creatures in accordance with reason. 2. The struggle for justice is an ongoing and necessary pursuit that should prevail over laws and institutions. 3. One's body is inviolable, subject to one's own will alone. 4. The freedoms of others should be respected, including the freedom to offend. To willfully and unjustly encroach upon the freedoms of another is to forgo one's own. 5. Beliefs should conform to one's best scientific understanding of the world. One should take care never to distort scientific facts to fit one's beliefs. 6. People are fallible. If one makes a mistake, one should do one's best to rectify and resolve any harm that might have been caused. 7. Every tenet is a guiding principle designed to inspire nobility in action and thought. The spirit of compassion, wisdom, and justice should always prevail over the written or spoken word. The Satanic Temple seems to make a specific effort to outwardly partake in protesting governmental affairs, particularly when it comes to separation of church and state, as well as other things it sees as immoral, since unlike the Church of Satan, this religion explicitly does believe in right and wrong. For these reasons, they will often challenge hate groups and are seen often defending women's reproductive rights, among other things. AJ believes that Infect would have genuinely liked the Satanic Temple. Finally, we have Chaos Satanism. In Psychedelic Chaos Satanism, 2 more things that are frequently mentioned on his website. For these ones, AJ specifically wrote about what she saw as the meaning behind these, as they're a definition that she said was coined by her own husband. Really, they do pretty much live up to the name, as it's comprised by the use of psychedelics as well as the concepts of chaos and Satan. Psychedelics taken out of the right condition are something she, and presumably Infect, described as the surest way to initiate a sublime or spiritual experience. She describes them as interrogating our theories of mind, creating more questions than answers, and opening a doorway for the imagination. They are powerful tools capable of invoking transcendent experience in the right setting, or profound mental disturbances in the wrong. Chaos theory is essentially what we mentioned earlier with chaos magic. It's the idea that has to do with the fate of the universe. It argues that there is an element of chaos in the fabric of reality, and as we were describing with chaos magic, those rituals seek to control your fate in one way or another. Finally, there is Satanism. As we've shown multiple times with Satanism, they usually do not mean that these people literally worship Satan. Instead, in this case as well, Satan is a symbol, a form of protest against the evils of organized religion. When you put all 3 of these concepts together, you get Psychedelic Chaos Satanism. But what about Infect himself? What I've done so far is learned and given a base of retrospective on the things that, in a large way, made up who he was. These things were very important to who Infect was as a person, and already, as you can see, they clear up certain things on the website. However, this of course is just one aspect to who Infect was as a person. From the person who was engaged to him, let's hear the true story of Infect bin Laden. In 1952, Infect bin Laden was born. While growing up, it quickly became apparent that he was a very intelligent, though very outspoken young man. He was described as being a radical. He was an anti-capitalist, anti-authoritarian, pro-LGBTQ+, and a strong defender of environmental protection. He was actually born into what should have been a fortune. His father was a millionaire, but this was because of war profiteering. Infect despised this and never accepted it in his life, calling it blood money. As the website described earlier, he was also into psychedelics from a pretty young age, though he reportedly never ever touched alcohol. He grew up during the boom of counterculture in the 60s, which no doubt was very influential to his life at the time. He even became very close friends with Jerry Garcia of the Grateful Dead. As he described on the website, he experienced a few specific occurrences during his youth and up until young adulthood that changed his outlook on everything, specifically through his observations of his grandmother and the death of his sister. He was also very into martial arts, having 5 black belts. He ran a martial arts school as a teacher, teaching mostly Wing Chun. Meanwhile, on the other side of things, there was AJ. She was raised by very religious parents, which really began to hit its forefront by the time she became a teenager. It was emphasized constantly that she could not have sex before marriage and that sex was bad. Love was good. These sentiments of sex equals bad and love equal good were dialed into her head so often that it began leading to extreme stress and confusion, especially around this age. She was thinking very often about it, perhaps like lots of people at that age do. This wasn't hid well from her parents, and the scoldings only got worse. She began accepting the fact that she was going to be a sinner. The divide between sex and love also widened as a result of these influences. She also began realizing that she could only be attracted to men that she couldn't love. She experienced falling in love, but when that happened, the sexual attraction disappeared. This all created a huge deal of pain for her. This whole manner of thinking forced upon her pretty much introduced her to the world of kink, which is very ironic looking back. She named these kinky, perhaps taboo sexual interests bad sex. Around the age of 18, she rejected religion entirely and thought of herself as an atheist. Around this same time, though, she found out about a lot of these aforementioned practices. She lived in a pagan commune for some time where she first began to study the concepts of magic. In 1991, she would move to Seattle to further study and explore magic and other things like it. At around this age, her vision of magic was different than it would wind up being. She really did want to believe that magic was a tool that could genuinely change the universe for her. By 1995, she was naturally in a much higher state of knowledge regarding all of these things. While hanging out with a group, she first laid her eyes upon Infek. She heard him talking all throughout that day and reveled in how intelligent he was. By the end of that night, she was sure that he was the smartest man she had ever met already. Over time, she gradually became much closer with him. As she went to his home, she couldn't help but notice just how many books he had. She mentioned how they were in every single room, in every single spot. These books were about a wide range of subjects too, whether that be science fiction, religion, philosophy, and much more. She also mentioned that he had artifacts from all over the world. In her own words, she described it as a crazy museum of chaos and beauty. As time passed, she fell for him and he did too. The most incredible realization of all was another ironic one. While engaging in what she described as bad sex, she finally was able to experience the concept of genuine love. She finally did not lose her love for him as this happened. She also didn't lose her attraction to him either. In fact, for the first time ever, everything was able to be augmented. It was a beautiful paradox. In their life together, she also described him with those exact same words. She mentioned that he was a very loving father, a very loyal person, and a very talented gardener. On the other hand, she also mentioned that he had a very dark side. He had a lot of personal demons, and this notion took face on what seemed like his life philosophy. He taught AJ that no one is all bad and no one is all good. Everybody contains angels and demons. The difference is, Infect was not afraid to ponder his. He was really open to it. He unmasked them and understood them. This was something she would truly understand the longer she did know him. Infect was able to harmonize his darker tendencies by involving himself in the things he was passionate about. This included martial arts, writing, and well, kink. He was a very hardcore sadist, but in the years he knew AJ, he never laid a hand on her or harmed her in anger. A few years into the relationship, Infect was diagnosed with terminal cancer. Following this, Death in Hell in its own primitive form was born. Staying true to the welcome message, Death in Hell really was that snapshot of the world as it appeared to him at that time. It was full of criticism towards the government, criticism of consumer culture, religion, and so many other things. The cryptic nature of this site was also purposeful, so I was told. It showcased his personal philosophy and his personality in a way even if a lot of the writings weren't even really from his perspective. It was his sarcophagus after all. Criticism on the state of the world as a whole seemed to be the main theme here, and he wrote a lot of it as a joke in one way or another. Supposedly he would often be laughing hysterically as he wrote. While the concept in terms of trolling wasn't really much of a thing yet, AJ herself mentioned that he would surely be considered a troll by today's standards based on the things he did. He had a very love or hate relationship online at the time, and if someone annoyed him enough, he would even create whole articles about them on the website. One of the common things he would do was to purposely switch specific words in existing articles or websites on the internet. At some point he found an article all about a prostitute explaining how she thought of her customers, who were commonly referred to as Johns. He took the term sex worker and changed it to working sex magician. He then took the word John and changed it to vessel, which is a concept that we saw get put to use on one of the very first things we saw on the website. The result was extremely cryptic to read from an outsider, but once you understand, it's almost simple. Lots of this site would be full of this type of tactic. Another thing the site really focused on was predicting the future, and typically, perhaps also understandably, this future was often pretty bleak. Even though this site was being worked on in the late 1990s, there were a lot of predictions about the then relatively new phenomenon of AI. He predicted that as AI advances, it would undoubtedly begin getting used for pleasure by people, which spawned another nickname, the Hot Vessel Cadaver, that is also used all over the site. Around the year 1997, he began going by a very specific nickname online, Infection. Soon enough, this would wind up changing to the name that we know now, Infect Bin Laden. But what was the true reason he chose this name? Well, around the same time when he started going by it, AJ asked him why he was choosing to use this name. He told her about some guy in the Middle East named Osama bin Laden. Around that time, he originally saw him as being pretty ballsy since he was outspoken, making tons of commentaries about the US military. At the same time, Infek also prophesied that bioweapons were going to be a large part of the future. Infection was a reference to this, as it was referencing the infection that would result from this. On the day of 9/11, Infek was now bedridden at home in hospice care. AJ was by his side every night, having to wake up every 3 hours to give him anti-nausea meds and pain meds. During one of her brief moments of sleep, she heard Infek calling for her. As she got up, she saw him pointing to the TV, which she completely thought was just a movie at the first glance. When she asked about it, he said that something terrible was happening. As the weeks went by, news came out and direct action from the US was on the way too. These events disturbed Infek to his core. While he lay powerless on his bed, he explained how he feared for the US and his entire family. He spent most of his time after that thinking more about the future. He thought about all the terrifying prophecies he had made over the years and was sure that they were going to pass, even if he wasn't here to see it. Sadly, just a few months later, he would pass away. So with everything we have gone through, let's visit this website once more. What was once one of the most off-putting and disturbing things I'd seen, suddenly is quite different. Don't get me wrong, lots of the subject matter is still very disturbing and darkness is one of the keys to this entire place, but everything certainly doesn't feel the same anymore. When you really dig into the site again with the knowledge we have gained, you can see so many of the things that we mentioned come into fruition. Even if we can't pick out every reference, I can see the strategies of taking existing articles and simply replacing words to give them a new effect, the prophecies of the future, and various other things. I can see how this site was a sarcophagus, the culmination of a love story of life, of death, of comedy, of fear, of good, of evil, and of so much more. AJ even gave me a list of notes that she wrote about what she felt the site meant all the way back in 2001. Mainstream media is all the bad disguised as good. Deathandhell.com is all the good disguised as bad. Deathandhell.com is a meme bomb set to explode in the future. Deathandhell.com is a spontaneous, symptomatic response to the condition of mankind. Deathandhell.com is an exercise in belief-generated reality tunnels. If you embrace great evil with pure undistracted love, shortly you will find a wounded child, heart in hand. Knowledge of darkness begets more light, as the soul is illuminated by understanding, not ignorance. Condemn not your suffering, as the deepening of spirit is always a gift. Let's revisit something I said much earlier too. If you knew you were going to die soon, what would you do? This website truly did serve as one man's answer to that question. Within the walls of Death and Hell, it seems that these articles served as a way for Infek to do something he spoke of often, to explore the depths of depravity. Whether that be his own, the depravities of the everyman, or the depravities of the world. Something else was that though he may not have ever realized it, he may have accidentally created his own Book of the Law, the very thing he solved. He might have created it once more in a new form. Because as much understanding as we have gotten from this journey, we'll never be able to understand absolutely everything on the entire website. And that might be okay. While being his sarcophagus, its cryptic nature is going to make it an endless source of fascination, as it already has been for 20 years. After the death of Infek, AJ's practices in magic began to fade away, as quite naturally, they began serving as a reminder of the pain she had gone through, so she began doing other things, such as returning to school. While studying philosophy, she began studying performance art too, seeking a way to create visuals to the philosophies she had. She even briefly moved to Europe to become an English teacher. She also was able to fall in love again, almost a decade later. She's described her current partner as being similar to Infek, but certainly not the same. He's also into satanic things, art, and horror, but she mentions how he is free of the worst demons that Infek had. Since 2010, they have been married, and AJ has described the present as being the happiest times of her whole life. In 2019, AJ would publish a book entitled, "You Might Be a Psychedelic Chaos Satanist If," described as being an illustrated book of political adult humor that addresses the ethical shortcomings of organized religion through a critical counterculture lens. It is comprised of 41 pithy remarks, which characterize this seemingly radical position in such a way that open-minded readers may find themselves sympathetic, especially in these times of great moral crisis and postmodern confusion. However, it is also the final chapter to this entire saga, serving as a representation of Infek, and how this magic lives on through her. As for still remaining questions, namely there was the question of who owns the website since it is still up to this day. Well, that too would be none other than AJ. She mentioned the fact that she originally purchased it in 1998 as a gift for Infek. She even mentioned the desire to update aspects of the site since everything is so ancient now. As it may be obvious from Infek's intro letter to the site, AJ will strive to keep the site up for as long as she lives due to the love that they shared. After she's gone, she hopes that some of his followers will keep the place running. She even revealed the fact that he did not ever want this site to be twisted or ruined. On his deathbed, he told her, "There can be no congregation. Don't let them ruin it. No church or cult of me, please." As this saga comes to a close, I find myself reflecting. We are living in unparalleled times, with an increase of digital footprints for the individual as the internet continues to become more and more mainstream. I was wondering about what my own version of deathandhell.com would contain if I were to ever create my own sort of online sarcophagus in a similar vein to that. But it was during that thought where I realized that that might have already happened. What are the odds that after I'm long gone, aspects of this here channel find themselves still floating around, waiting for people completely unfamiliar with us and our entire living lives to experience them? What are the odds that someone accidentally stumbles upon a social media account of yours long after you're gone and they explore it, learning about the trials and tribulations of a human being that never had anything to do with them? More curiously, how would you be perceived? That's unfortunately not something I have an answer to. I never knew Infek, and while I may have gotten to speak to the closest person to him, that fact still remains. In that sense, all I could do was perceive him based on what I read and saw, and similarly, that reigns true for everybody watching here too. And I'm sure that there are already a multitude of different conclusions that you can make on him, based on what the site was all about and what I was able to learn about him. Likewise, I'm sure that some of these conclusions will be really positive, and some of them will be really negative, which in reality would likely live up to his own personal philosophy in life. And if there's one final thematic takeaway to leave this all with, it's that while the future can be horrifying, filled with unknown answers and questions, please take the time to look at what you have going for you in the moment. The incredible interests and hobbies you have, the beautiful relationships you have created, the impact you have made on others, because you never know how much time you have left.
Every chapter. And then after that, the final epistles, that's Hebrew to Revelation. This is our studio, and there's Bonnie right there in the bottom right corner. And we actually have a version of that. There are 6 cameras and all that stuff that goes into a suitcase. And I mean, wherever we are, I mean, I've sat in London, I've sat in Paris, I've sat in all the places where we've taught. And in our house where we're staying, wherever they give us, I get in the corner and set, and I just keep the classes going with the small groups. Number 3, our third greatest blessing after seeing Scott and then finishing half of our goal to get these recordings done, Bonnie and I get to serve together. This is Bonnie teaching the ladies. She was in this room packed with women, all of them refugees, all of them from things that I could hardly say in public. There's one lady, I shouldn't point, but her back is to us, and you see her in that chair there. She supported her family coming from Nigeria. She supported them in the Termini in Rome as a prostitute. That's how her family ate, because her husband couldn't get a job, and he approved reluctantly for her to earn their money as a prostitute. She came as a refugee, came to the church. This is in northern England. Got led to Christ by this sweet family that runs the refugee center, and her husband's now an elder at that church. I went to the prayer meeting she leads, that lady. I've never been in a prayer meeting like that in my life. Have you ever been in a Nigerian prayer meeting? I mean, I felt like I was somewhere in the tabernacle in the wilderness with Moses. I mean, she was quoting verses at the top of her voice, and everybody was with her doing it, and it was just the most marvel in English. And she was talking about all the verses she knows about knowing she's cleansed and forgiven and in the sight of Christ blameless. She was a prostitute in the Termini before she was saved. And now she's the leader of the women's ministry. Her husband is an elder. And Bonnie got to teach him. And she did the Doctrine of God, and I just got the men. And I had men from 19 countries, and fascinating. Just some testimonies. Tara Brown wrote us and said, I wish I could come to, she heard I was coming to Calvary. Your sermon saved me. What she's saying is she's one of those COVID people. This one, they're in the UK, and they are in the 52 greatest chapters. And they decided that since they couldn't find a local church, they started a Bible study with their 4 kids in their home. Have you ever been in a British home? They're about as small as a starter home, like one of those space-saving ones that you can sweep the whole house with standing in one place. And they are inviting all their neighbors in with their 4 kids to do a Bible study because they want to serve the Lord. This is another one from Canada that got saved. I told you about the trucker in one of the services this morning. These are typical kids. These are the kids I'm around all the time. That's what makes it worthwhile to do this. Look at Bonnie. Bonnie, I wish you knew Bonnie on the road. Bonnie is like a college kid. She comes alive about 8 o'clock. And me, I'm so tired. I said, I got to get up at 5. I'm going to bed. She said, oh, honey, and she'll tuck me in poof, to the dorms. There she is with them. She just loves it. And she has become the godly older woman and mother figure that none of these kids ever had. I mean, some of them, both parents are gone, or parents are divorced, or parents have disowned them, and she gets to do that. And I mean, this was Bonnie teaching on marriage, and look, all the men came in because they weren't supposed to. It was just a ladies' meeting. This is where I teach in New York, and then this is the last thing I wanted to tell you. Do you ever wonder what I do with all the thousands of dollars of books I sell? Does any of you ever wondered about that? Come on, be honest. I mean, I can't believe all these people on YouTube just buy thousands of dollars of books. Well, what we've done, Bonnie and I mean, of course, we don't keep any of it, but Discover the Book now supports with the book money. I mean, it's thousands and thousands of dollars. So far, 29 of our graduates that we personally have trained. We saw them as kids. A lot of them are getting married. They're serving in Taiwan, Japan, Hungary, Korea, the Philippines, and we're adding 5 new countries this year. So if you know anybody, tell them buy a book. Tell them you know what happens to the money. That it'll go to someone that lives on $350 a month and lives on Cebu and wants to reach the Muslims for Christ. So we're thankful. By the way, we left here after 1 month of fundraising and raised all $6,100 from Calvary Bible Church. Did you know that? We live on $6,100 a month, and the Saints of Calvary in 1 month committed that. And I'd say other than the ones that have died and a few people that have had hardship, they're all still supporting us. And we, as you can tell, I eat very well. And the Lord is blessing. And we're thankful for you. Let's all stand, and we're going to close in prayer. And I don't know if Ryan's going to come up, but if not, if he doesn't come up during the prayer, you can leave. Okay, let's pray. Father, I thank you, as Bonnie and Julia and Estelle in their different presentations mentioned, that we are thrilled to be a part of seeing those from every kindred, tribe, tongue, and nation that have been gloriously converted. And they want to go back and reach their own. And thank you that you're doing that now in such a time of deception, helping these young people to get grounded in the truth, to understand doctrine, and to be able to resist the lies of the deceiver. And I pray that we would be challenged, that Calvary Bible saints would be challenged to get back to those basics, memorize Scripture, and talk about it with friends. And find out what they're memorizing, and find out what works and what encourages and what helps us to resist Satan's many attacks. And I pray that we would, as Hebrews 10 says, exhort one another, and so much the more as we see the day approaching, the day of your coming, and also the day of darkness in this world of Satan's deceptions. Help us to have healthy relationships built around your word. Help us to have healthy verses we're memorizing and healthy Bibles that we study doctrine in and understand and take people with us to heaven. Thank you for letting us meet. In the precious name of Jesus we pray. And all God's people said, amen. And God bless you as you go.